Welcome to the Enlightenment Podcast and to our listeners and viewers around the world. We've been very focused on Palestine, our past several podcasts, but today we're having a little change of gear and discussing Lebanon as well. With Israel's continuing occupation of part of Lebanon and with over 100 attacks on the country since signing the ceasefire, we feel it's essential to share some context that is often missing from legacy media. So we are very excited and privileged today to explore Lebanon's history, culture, resilience, and its ties to Palestine with writer and blogger Amal Ghandour. Amal, welcome to the Enlightenment Podcast.
Very happy to be here, Shamim. Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. So for those of you who are not familiar, let me briefly introduce Amal. Amal Ghandour is a Lebanese-Jordanian author and blogger. So This Arab Life is Amal's blog. She has a career spanning more than 3 decades in research, communication, and community development. She's the author of 2 books. The first one is called About This Man Called Ali. And the second is This Arab Life, A Generation's Journey into Silence, which came out in October 2022, and which Amal herself describes as a memoir that's not of an individual, but of the generation that came of political age in the 1980s in the Levant. So we'll be discussing that more during the podcast. Her blog, here we go, This Arab Life, is on Substack. Well worth a read if you haven't had a look already. And Amal holds an MS in International Policy from Stanford University, a BS-FS from Georgetown. Her writings have appeared in publications as varied as Le Monde, Aeon, The Daily Beast, the Washington Independent Review of Books, Canvas, and the Marquez Review. So very, very highly accomplished. We're very lucky to have her on there. Before we go straight to Amal, let me ask the big Hanan question. How do you know Amal? Hanan?
Yeah, well, when Amal moved to Amman from Beirut after the civil war in Jordan in 1970, the war, and then Amal moved in, we were around 9 years old, and really we became best friends immediately. Amal was extremely, highly intelligent, a breath of fresh air, open-minded, had a very different perspective to life, which I really found refreshing and wonderful. And we were extremely close growing up. We spent a lot of time in each other's homes. Her parents became like my parents. And Amal's dad, in particular, Ammu Ali, Allah yarhamah, was one of the most progressive people that you would meet of his generation, and really a brilliant mind. It was always a pleasure spending time with Amal and her family. And Amal, truly wonderful to have you with us today, Habibti.
Thank you so much, Hanan. It's been a long time, so nice to see you, nice to see Shamim, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you, me too.
Okay, well, I'm going to kick it off. So, Amal, your parents are Lebanese. You live in Beirut with your mom and your sister. For listeners who are not that familiar with Lebanon's complex religious diversity and political history, can you provide an overview that simplifies those complexities for everyday people? There's a big question to start with.
Yeah, actually, it's not only my mother and sister. My mother and sisters, we're all here. My eldest sister, Asma, as well, is here. Raghida comes and goes, and obviously I'm here. So it's more of a family circumstance than it is just my mother and sister. So we found ourselves quite attached to Lebanon over the years. But look, the one thing you don't want to do when it comes to Lebanon is try to simplify it. I mean, it's quite extraordinary for a country of this small size to be this complicated, but there you have it. So, I mean, if we're looking at the everyday person that to whom you refer, I suppose perhaps the best guidance for them are the defining features of Lebanon. So you can start with Lebanon as a colonial construct. It is a colonial construct like all other countries that compose or constitute the Levant. Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Iraq. And here we're, of course, talking about the larger area of the Fertile Crescent, and of course, Israel. So we're talking about a colonial construct that was designed primarily by the British and the French in the aftermath of World War I to serve their purpose and interest rather than to reflect the collective aspirations and interests of the people. Now, Lebanon itself, even when it was a smaller, if you like, semi-autonomous Mount Lebanon under the Ottomans in the 19th century. This is my cat, one of my cats meowing to go into the kitchen. So forgive me for just pointing this out because she's starting to meow. But anyways, so even the much smaller Mount Lebanon was rich in its sectarian makeup. You had even then, the five main sects in Lebanon: the Sunnis, the Maronites, the Shiites, the Druze, of course, and the Greek Orthodox. These continue to be the main sects in Lebanon, but of course we have officially 17 sects. So it's a diverse country of many sects, four of whom really dominate the politics of the country and have historically competed for dominance and power. You have as well, from the time of inception, a country, a state, if you like, that is constitutionally weak. And they're more to serve the interests of the ruling elite, who themselves are a very intimately intertwined sectarian business and financial interests with very clear oligopolistic tendencies. And of course, you've had rolling crises in the country. You've had the major civil war that erupted in 1975 and ended in 1990, which introduced the militia economies and helping to further distort what was already a very troubled political economy, if you like. We have to our south a very aggressive Israeli neighbor who's always wanted to have a piece of us. And to our east, we have a Syrian neighbor who's never accepted that we were no longer a piece of them. So that has always put us in a very delicate position in the Levant. We have, of course, a beautiful country, lush, coquettish, highly exposed to outside cultures, very hospitable towards them. We've had a tendency, our sects, of course, have had a tendency to be very welcoming of foreign influence in the service of local ambitions and interests, and a freewheeling kind of a political scene, culture that made us a magnet at a time in the 20th century when Arab states themselves were tending towards the more authoritarian models of government. That made us very attractive, and that made us as well very vulnerable. So this is essentially Lebanon. If you want to understand, if you want to have a better idea of the context that has made for the fragility, the chronic instability of this country, I think if you just allow these 5 features always to frame your understanding, you would have a much better time of comprehending the history of this very complicated country and the politics of it.
And speaking of fragility, Amal, I mean, Lebanon and your family have experienced numerous wars and attacks by the Zionist colony of Israel. Um, and activism often stems from deeply personal journeys. How did you find your path, and was it something you envisioned, or did it evolve over time? From when you were little kiddies to as you went and did all your degrees and became very active.
Well, you bestow upon me a label that I don't deserve. I've never thought of myself as an activist, and I don't think I've ever been really an activist in the conventional definition of the term. Whatever engagement I have undertaken over the decades has always been in the very safe space that was allowed us under really quite intolerant regimes of kind of serious activism. I think others deserve this label much more than I do. And one of the reasons, I know you want to ask me about this Arab life later on, but one of the reasons I wrote this book is precisely this abdication of duty, this kind of silence that my generation, which came of age in the 1980s, journeyed towards. So engaged, yes. Activist, not really. Over the past 10 years, it is true that I've dedicated more time to writing. Yes, it's gained a very sharp edge. Yes, I am, to a large degree, very, very much engaged in political, social, and cultural issues, often very critical. But I think the label is really a little too grand, and my accomplishments in this field are a little too modest. So
I think you're being too modest, Amal, because activism really, I mean, it's whether film, music, writing, speaking, you've been very eloquent, and I'm sure you've influenced a lot of people. But
I hope so, but,
definitely.
Well, it might just be the label. I mean, you're preaching to the converted with me and Hanan. We're very big believers in writers and storytellers and people who just kind of bring some aspect of life alive in a certain context for helping to influence rather than pushing a narrative down people's throats. So all credit to you for that. But let's go back to, because you mentioned that Lebanon is a product of colonialism, and of course all of the countries in West Asia, that region, are. Obviously, colonialism has had a deep impact on this whole area. Could you just expand a little bit on that? On the effects of colonialism in this region to divide up these countries in such a way? Did it have an effect on sectarian divisions within what we now know as Lebanon, or anything else about colonialism you'd like to discuss?
The sectarian divisions of Lebanon preceded the French colonial experience. What the French did is come, build on it, entrench it, and allow it to become the core of our political process in the country. But really, the sectarian divisions and the richness that I referred to earlier preceded the French. Colonialism in Lebanon is colonialism there are different features, of course, different influences, different ways that it translates in different countries, but I think the corrosion is more or less the same. When you are denied agency, when your self-worth is questioned, when an outsider determines for you what kind of life you want to live, what kind of political system you want to thrive under or live under, when you are forced to weave, if you like, a social contract that best reflects their interests rather than yours. It's corrosive. It's very corrosive. So I think, if I were to be sitting here talking to the Egyptian or to the Libyan or to any, most African citizens from different countries, Latin America, I think we would find that we have much in common when it comes to the colonial experience. So
Yeah.
it does lend itself to these common denominators, really, these shared, very painful experiences. And Lebanon is no exception. Now, mind you, this is not to say that we didn't do our part as a people, and more specifically, I would have to say, as elites, in further entrenching this experience, in internalizing it, and actually, in the final analysis, defending it. We've done our part, really, the French and the British and the Americans and all other colonial powers have come into these countries and have left elites that are really more than willing to defend the colonial construct. And I think we've done really a very good job in doing this.
Well, isn't that, I love the word corrosive, by the way. I think it's so perfect for colonialism because it is that. And I think for me, growing up, born and raised in the UK, when I would think of Lebanon, the images that would come to mind is this Paris of the East, and this sort of feeling of the south of France, and it's a relaxed, hip city. But it's exactly that. It's that planting of an elitist world that says, look, you too can have the feeling of Paris in West Asia, without asking if that's the right thing for that community, for these sects that live there. It's just kind of an imposed thing, and saying it's so much better to be like the British or to be like the French.
To introduce a bit of nuance into this, parts of it were like the Paris of the Middle East. I mean, that's just part of the reality. The problem is that when you think it is singularly the reality, it wasn't singularly the reality. It was the reality to quite a few Lebanese who belong to a certain strata of society, to city-bound people. There's Beirut has been one of the more cosmopolitan, vivacious cities of the Near East. All this is real. All this is very real, but it's not the entire reality. And, you've heard the old story about the poverty belt that engulfed Beirut. You've heard about the social inequities. You've heard about of course, the jarring contrast between the countryside and the city, and so on and so forth. These are, again, also experiences that you find many old colonies share with each other. So I want to be clear about Lebanon. There's much that recommends it in that regard. Yes, the Paris of the Middle East. Yes, very sophisticated. Yes, a lot of fun. And in fact, a kind of like a paradise of intrigue. I think Hanan's parents, my parents, have an experience of this country that we haven't had. I mean, I've lived in Lebanon since 1991. I have my own particular experience of it, but I understand what they lived, and I see it in many respects here. But it's not the entire reality. Make it the entire reality, and then you're falling into the same generalizations and stereotyping that find us misreading and misinterpreting a very complicated country like Lebanon.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, Amal, not even our parents, but my grandfather, it was like his third country after Palestine, Jordan, and then Lebanon. He had a place there, and land and so on. They spent a lot of summers and time in Beirut and that. So they had a different experience, absolutely. And that was quite a while ago. So, Amal, the Zionist colony of Israel attacked Lebanon over the years, and causing immense devastation. Most people just see it now. They don't understand that this is an ongoing history of these attacks. Can you just talk a bit more about that and their consequences?
Well, I mean, if you want to go, if you really want to delve into the Lebanese Israeli experience, you can go as far back as the early years of the 20th century after World War I, well before there was an independent Lebanon in 1946 and an Israel in 1948. But I suspect that what you are asking about is the more recent history of this conflict. And I suppose you can start with 1968 and Israel's very interesting name. They always have very interesting names for their operations. Operation in 1968, an attack on the on Beirut's international airport that destroyed 12 airplanes belonging to the MEA and LIA, Lebanese International Airways, which it just so happens, by the way, was the private airline that my father had found with the Arida brothers in the mid-50s. But of course, in 1968, my father was already very much a Jordanian.
Yeah.
But that destroyed the airline. LIA never ever could make it after that day. And then you would want to count 1978, Israel's invasion of southern Lebanon, 1982, Israel's invasion of Lebanon and siege of Beirut, 1993, the attacks and counterattacks between Hezbollah and Israel, 1996, 2006, and of course now 2024. In between, we're talking about much smaller incidents and episodes, assassinations, bombings, targeting of centers or headquarters or areas, smaller scale, more brief, but essentially constituting 50 years of what you can very persuasively argue is a chronic war, chronic state of war between Lebanon and Israel. Two main reasons. The first one is the festering Palestinian problem. The PLO in from the late 60s to 1982, basically, when they were shipped off to Tunisia after the siege of Beirut, wanted to force the international community to move towards a peace process that would lead to a Palestinian state, and used southern Lebanon as a staging ground for attacks against Israel. And Israel used southern Lebanon and Lebanon in an effort to prevent or to kill any such process that would lead to a Palestinian state. The other reason, of course, is the Israeli occupation of Lebanon since 1982. That brought birth to Hezbollah, which turned out to be, of course, a much more lethal force than the PLO, managing to push out the Israelis in the year 2000 and retaining for itself the title and role of resistance movement that continued to define the friction between the tension between Israel and Lebanon, and the, of course, eruption of violence and conflict every 2-3 years almost. The consequences of this are obvious. A ruined South, hobbled. The South is a very rich region, by turns hobbled and ruined by the continuous Israeli attacks. Today, it's practically destroyed. Polarized politics in Lebanon. We have to understand that in Lebanon, Hezbollah is, of course, a dominant force, but it's how shall I put it? It's a behemoth of an organization and a country that is really tiny, fragile, and doesn't like to take itself too seriously. Okay? The struggle with Israel is very serious business. The politics of Lebanon is not serious business. And I think the kind of hit that Hezbollah has taken, and it has taken a hit over the past year, especially since, of course, September, is to a certain degree, not entirely, but to a certain degree, a reflection of this kind of imbalance that you always find in a country like Lebanon. Small, fragile, playful, wants to have a good time, enjoy life, really, and forces inside that want for it a role that is really entirely too ambitious for the country itself. And you've seen it playing out over the past, I would say, few decades, in fact, right from the start of I would go back to 1920. We can look at different historical periods in Lebanon where we've always found this kind of friction between what certain groups wanted for the country and what the country really could play. So
interesting.
A lot of people don't realize how small, when you say small population, I think it's around 4 million right now, the Lebanese, right? Something like that.
Estimate, well, here you go. We haven't done a population census since the 1930s because of the very sensitive sectarian issue. No sect wants to come to terms with the demographic changes that have transpired over the past 70 years or so. So we have guesstimates, we have relatively reliable guesstimates, but that's all we have. There are, in fact, more than guesstimates, I would have to say, because every parliamentary election cycle, you are able to really have a very reliable count of the number of different sects. But we haven't had a population census because nobody wants to touch this very sensitive subject. It is so tiny. It is a tiny, tiny country. It's like 10,400 square kilometers. So the estimate by the United Nations, last I saw, was around anywhere between 4.5 and 5.5 million. Of course, it also depends on whether you want to count the Palestinian refugees and the Syrian refugees, and that's, of course, very fluid. Typically, the estimate of Palestinian refugees has always been at 450,000. That's been extremely inflated. The best study I have seen has estimated them now, today, at around 120, 125,000, because many Palestinians have actually left, because the way they were treated in this country is abominable, shameful, and they continue to be treated that way. So quite a few Palestinians have packed up and left. The Syrian...
Sorry, Amal, and just for the listeners who don't know, a lot of Palestinians after 48 end up in Lebanon from the north, from Haifa and other places, and many ended up in refugee camps and still do, those who couldn't afford to live in cities and
several refugee camps, yes. In
Yeah.
Sidon, up in the north, of course, in Tripoli, in Beirut, yes. Several, and of course the most famous of them, unfortunately, are Tal al-Zatar and Sabra and Shatila, which experienced the horror of massacres during the Civil War.
That's right. And for those who don't know, it's in 82, especially the Sabra and Shatila, even though the US brokered a deal with the PLO to leave for Tunis, and that their women and children will be protected regardless, the minute they left Lebanon, they went and slaughtered, when the Israelis allowed the Phalange to come and slaughter all the civilians and women, children, atrocious, horrific massacre or massacres that occurred. So that's also, maybe you want to talk about that a bit, Amal, if you want to.
Well, what's to say? I mean,
Yeah.
it's heartbreaking, and you know, it's like play, rewind, repeat for the Palestinians. Each time more horrific than the time before it.
Yeah.
Now, of course, culminating in the genocide in Gaza and the ethnic cleansing that's going on in the West Bank. Play, rewind, repeat.
Yeah.
Devastating. Not only in Lebanon, in Syria, Yarmouk camp, in Jordan, in the Jordanian civil war in 1970.
Yeah.
Reluctant there to a certain degree, but nonetheless.
Yeah.
And of course, we can talk about, but you know, it's probably a digression, but we can talk about the responsibility that the PLO has for much, not much, but a considerable part of the suffering and pain of the Palestinians themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's probably a topic for
another conversation, a long one.
Well, just before we move on for that 1982 invasion, there's an Israeli perspective movie called Lost with Bashir by a soldier. It's an animation movie, but it's something that people might be interested to look up. I saw it many years ago, but it dealt with the guilt and the aftermath from an Israeli perspective of being involved in those horrific massacres.
Well, it didn't help, you know, beyond perhaps a few days of guilt or whatever. It certainly didn't help much because
it's always a very individual moment of a thing. Unfortunately, not a collective moment that actually changes anything, sadly. But Amal, I wanted to go back to Hezbollah because I was really interested in the way you vividly brought to life this picture of Lebanon as sort of a small, freewheeling, happy-go-lucky place, and Hezbollah is this big behemoth that's very serious. Now, just to recap, Hezbollah was formed in 1982 to help resist Israel's invasion of Lebanon. But that your characterization felt to me like maybe they're oppressive in some way. They're certainly demonized in the West, and yet to me it looks as though there's a limited capacity for Lebanon to just say we just want to have a good time, because there is all this pressure from external to be occupied by Israel. So is Hezbollah a good thing?
Right. So I don't want to suggest that we Lebanese are a silly people. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying that this country is really a very small, fragile, troubled place.
Yeah.
So to assign to it a role as serious and as pivotal as the struggle against Israel is really perhaps asking too much of it. That's what I'm trying to say. It's very fragile in every aspect of life, practically, politically, socially. It has a weak state with very limited authority. It has a very aggressive competing sects. So to add to it the very serious struggle of Israel is to add to the pressures on this country. I mean, that's inevitable. So I don't mean to suggest that we're all, you know, silly people who want to have a party.
No, I didn't either. But
no. I mean,
context,
I just want to correct it for the viewers when they're watching. I don't want to suggest that, but I'm saying that there is a again, as I said, there's a jarring contrast between what Hezbollah is, what its mission is, what its multiple identities are, what its ambitions are, and what Lebanon is. There is clearly a very jarring contrast here. As for Hezbollah itself, again, one wants to always be nuanced when it comes to politics in general. Frankly, when it comes to every conversation, every topic of discussion, you always want to be very nuanced. Unfortunately, the heated and polarized politics of the region pushes us always towards the black and white. It's never black and white. So if you take Hezbollah in Lebanon, it started out, of course, as singularly a resistance movement against the Israelis. It proved to be extremely successful, highly disciplined, highly motivated, absolutely ideological, with very close relationship to Iran. Iran was instrumental in creating Hezbollah, in financing it, in building it up to be, up to a few months ago, the single most largest, if you like, single most critical, influential non-state actor in the world, not only in the region, in the world. A very formidable organization with serious regional ambitions and dominant political presence in Lebanon itself. Yes. It started out as a resistance group, and in the 1990s, certainly after the Israeli withdrawal from southern Lebanon in 2000, gradually develops interest in the politics of Lebanon and begins to assume more of a political role. A social organization as well that provides extensive services to its community, education, healthcare, many other services, in fact, social welfare, family support. And it chose to maintain all these identities at once. And it also began, being very encouraged by Iran as well, to undertake major missions outside of Lebanon, the last of which, of course, was the deployment in Syria in defense of Bashar Assad's regime. Perhaps one of the more strategic miscalculations on the part of Hezbollah, one has to admit.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, Shamim. As you said, Shamim, they've been demonized, Hezbollah, in the West, but people don't see or understand that they have a whole infrastructure to support their community, as you said, medical, education, and so on. But also politically, they have seats in the parliament. They're a big part of the fabric of the Lebanese political, as well as social, economic, and so on. And recently, you've just finally, I think 2 days ago, you had a president after 2 years. Shall we touch on that before we move on?
I'll touch on that a bit, but more on Hezbollah. Just to be clear, they developed a clear ambition in entering the political scene in Lebanon, and grew to dominate and to actually protect the regime. A very sectarian, very corrupt, a bankrupt regime. We need to be, and one of the perhaps the more paradoxical issues for Hezbollah is its insistence on separating between military resistance, the definition of resistance itself. Let's insistence on strictly understanding resistance as a military effort rather than a much more sophisticated effort, political, social, economic effort. So it involves itself in the political morass of Lebanon, which inevitably affected its ability to pose as an effective resistance to Israel. The weaker the state, the more corrupt, the more divisive, the weaker the military resistance. One of the reasons why Hezbollah had to accept the ceasefire just a couple of months ago, 13 clauses, very tough clauses that it had to accept, is partly because of the internal politics in Lebanon. It could not afford not to sign. And why? Because again, we're talking about Lebanon and the contradictions that Hezbollah, of course, fell into. I have to tell you something about Hamas and something about Hezbollah. The insistence on the part of these two formidable organizations to be a resistance and a dominant and to dominate government. It doesn't work. You either govern or you resist. Choose. They've insisted for a very long time that they can actually do both. Each role has its own responsibilities. It has its own requirements. It has its own pressures. And I think Hezbollah today is confronting this contradiction. Again, well, let's not call it a contradiction. Let's call it a friction, if you like, a friction between the two roles. You want to be a serious resistance against Israel, and you want to govern in Lebanon. Two different roles, two different requirements. For a long time, one has to admit they were able to join the two, but I think we see time and again the kind of friction that really puts them before some very difficult questions that they have to deal with, and I think this is one such time. As far as the new president is concerned, he's of course, the head of the army, was the head of the army. I don't know him personally. What I have read about him and what I've heard about him is that he's a decent man. He's a courageous man, not corrupt himself, but not a lot of people are going to like hearing this, but, and I hate to be the party pooper. In fact, that's the title that they gave me in the 1990s when I first moved here. When I was always cautioning my friends that this is all not going to end well. But the problems of this country are deep, very serious, existential. They pervade every aspect of life, and he is cosmetic. Now, is he serious? And you listen to his speech, if you have, 2 days ago when he won. It's the kind of speech that's given by a president that has actually the authority to implement. He doesn't. He does have moral authority. He does have some prerogatives and some authorities. But he was actually giving the speech of a revolutionary, because what he was saying he's going to be helping Lebanon transform towards is nothing short of revolutionary. Mm-hmm. And he was delivering the speech to the very people who are in the very real business of turning this country into the shambles that it is today. It's going to be a very tough task for him. He's going to need the kind of authority and the kind of support, internal and external, that he's not necessarily going to have. Our politicians are a distinct type of vulture. And they will oppose and attack and subvert and prevent any serious effort towards reform. We've had a meltdown, wholesale meltdown, economic, political, and financial in 2019, described by the World Bank as the worst they have registered since the 19th century worldwide. And that didn't move this ruling elite, this mafia, towards very necessary reforms for this really tiny place. It doesn't take that much to put Lebanon right, by the way. It really doesn't. If you're serious about it, it doesn't. But that didn't even move them. So I respect his intentions. I applaud them. I certainly support what he detailed in his speech. I don't want to be very pessimistic, but let's say, we need to be very alert to precedent. We need to be very aware of context. We need to understand that we've been through this experience before and come out very disappointed. So if I'm going to sound hopeful, I'm going to say to the Lebanese, approach this with a lot of caution, with a lot of humility, and certainly understand that certainly on the part of us, the elites, that we're going to have to work very seriously and concertedly towards the kind of reforms that are essential for this country. I mean, that's, I want to be hopeful, because I don't really, people are really genuinely relieved and happy, and I don't want to burst their bubble, but I tend to be far more pessimistic on this front, unfortunately.
Yeah. And also, Amal, and that's the internal, but also you have the external. I think the US has one of the largest embassies in the world in Lebanon, or building one. And then you have the French interference, and you still have all the sort of Western interference in Lebanon over and above.
Yeah, but Hanan, that's never been any different. That is the Lebanese story from the start, even before the formation of the modern state in 1920.
Yeah.
And that's why, when we started out with this conversation as to how might we help the everyday person understand Lebanon, one of the main features of this country is our tendency to be very welcoming, very susceptible to, and very welcoming of foreign interference in the service of very petty, parochial, sectarian ambitions and interests. It's not only the United States, and every single historical period in Lebanon has had its political stars, if you like. You start out with the French, and then you move towards Jamal Abdel Nasser versus the United States. Then you move towards the PLO versus Israel and the United States. Then you move towards Hezbollah, Iran versus Israel and the United States and France and this. And it's all very nuanced. Let me put it to you this way. France has a relationship with Hezbollah. In the when we were negotiating the maritime borders with Israel, the United States and the French were very happy to cede the decision-making to Hezbollah, who were the main negotiators of these maritime borders, which, by the way, were not really very advantageous to the Lebanese. A lot of nuance here. Yes, there are competing camps. Yes, there are warring camps. But a lot of times you find that they're having, very interesting conversations with each other. It's unfortunately for us in the Arab world, we tend to always take our politics in snapshots. Take now the war that has just ended. A snapshot, the destruction of the axis of resistance and the victory of Israel and the United States and the change to the geopolitics of the region. Snapshot. It is true for the time being, I think to a large extent, but it's a snapshot. Politics here, the geopolitics here is very fluid, it's dynamic, it's ever changing. At one period, you find a certain constellation of powers in retreat, and another, they are, emerging as major forces, so on and so forth. So I think we need to move away from this tendency to just, take a snapshot and try to understand or draw conclusions that are really much more long-term than they can possibly afford to be. And at the same time, certainly at this early hour, to just sit back, observe, take our time, understand that there are many unknowables, appreciate the fluidity of the moment, and just observe more and comment less. That's why, when a lot of people come to me and ask about, what do you think is going to happen in Syria? What do you think about? I understand the questions. I mean, I understand the people's curiosity and need to understand what's going on. But at the same time, I think it's very healthy for us to say every once in a while, I don't know. I don't know. You can draw 5, 6, 7, 8 different scenarios that are equally plausible. So I don't know. I think I digressed.
No,
There.
I love it. I love it. It's very interesting. But um, I wanted to ask you about Palestine as well, because this has been a big topic for us, and because we started this podcast because we realized so many people didn't realize that history didn't start on the 7th of October 2023. Let's go back to, if I can just take it back to 1947, the UN partition gave 56% of Palestinian land to Zionist settlers. And this was despite the fact that Palestinians owned at the time 94% of the land. So a lot of people just in one swoop lost their land. And that decision by the UN was from only 33 UN member states at that time, voting on that partition without the consent of Palestinians or Arabs at all. And what at a time that much of the world was under colonial rule, as we've discussed. So for me, this is a great example of colonialism and that mindset that continues to just dehumanize Palestinians and Arabs as people who shouldn't have their own say in their world. Do you have anything to say about the significance of that kind of decision and the lasting consequences for Palestine and the region?
Now, look at it. It's an 80-year-old injustice. Now, on a personal level, Shamim, and I think people tend to forget that the personal here, the human toll. I can tell you as a Levantine, and I think I speak for more people than regimes care to admit. There hasn't been, ever since I was born, and I think I can say the same for my parents, although my father passed away in 2020.
Allah yarhamah.
There has not been a single day of joy or a lazy Sunday afternoon or a cozy lunch or a very busy work day or a night of fun at the disco or the nightclub or fantastic evening drinks with friends where Palestine was not lurking somewhere in the picture. It is singularly, in my opinion, the most defining issue for us, because I think it's come to symbolize in many ways from the start the humiliation and sense of defeat that we Arabs have felt. It's not to say that Palestine is to blame for everything, but if you are to analyze with sensitivity and nuance the challenges and difficulties that we have encountered as a region since I would say mid-20th century to now, you will find that Palestine occupies a very central space in that constellation of problems. So the human toll is just extraordinary. For us Lebanese, now for the Palestinians, it's existential. And they face today their most perhaps difficult hour. In one of my posts, the title was The Paradox of Victory in Defeat and Defeat in Victory. You have the Palestinians today victorious in many ways, but at a moment like no other in their history. In my opinion, much worse than 1948, much worse, because 21st century genocide, cleansing, and a state, an Israeli state, that frankly understands today that there is no limit to its power. It can do whatever it wants without any kind of limitation or censure. So I think it's a very difficult moment for the Palestinians now. I mean, if you want to widen the lens, especially in the aftermath of October 7th, then you're talking, I think, about tectonic shifts. Early hours, it is true, but tectonic shifts, breaches everywhere, breaches within the American Jewish community, breaches between the younger Jews, American Jews, and older Jews, breaches within the Democratic Party in the United States, breaches between Europeans at grassroots level and European elites, extraordinary pressure on international covenants and agreements on international institutions, ICJ, ICC, the United Nations. And I dare say, the collapse of the Western order. I know that it's early hours yet, and I'm actually contradicting myself when I say that we need to be very circumspect and careful in what we forecast. But I don't think this is much of a forecast. I think we are witnessing it today. I don't know what person with any kind of self-respect could possibly take seriously the Western order. I'm sorry, it's just not real. In fact, it's reached a point of tragicomic proportions. I know that I tell you another breach that's very important, the breach between Arab elites, westernized Arab elites. We don't like to be described as such, many of us, but that's what we are. We studied in the West. We are very Western. We speak the language. We understand the culture. We bought into that whole, spiel. Now there's a major crisis between many of us and these elites, the soft power of Europe in the Middle East. There perhaps is not a crisis with the regimes, but there certainly is a crisis with the elites, and there certainly is a crisis with the people. I know that analysts and scholars that I respect tremendously really don't think that Palestine is moving the Arab people the way it used to. I'm not so sure about that. And I tell you, in the context of Arab uprisings that perhaps have failed in the first round, but have not ended, I think we will see Palestine continuing to play a very serious role. But let me stop here, really, because I don't want to end up really contradicting myself. I think we need to be a bit humble, of course, but much of what I've described, I think we're already seeing transpire. So to my mind, it's a very persuasive argument.
Absolutely. And I think, as you said, the veil has dropped on anything to do with so-called Western human rights, democracy, international institutions like the UN and so on. And going back to the UN just a little bit, Amal, those 33 countries that decided the fate of Palestine and the region and the world, really, when they gave away and they allocated 56% of Palestine illegally, that for me didn't belong to them in the first place without the consent of Palestinians or the Arab nations. And in 48, they stole 78% of the land. And when we keep hearing about the two-state solution, and we'll move on to that in a minute, and defining the 67 borders, there's no mention of that additional land stolen. And I think we'll unpack it in a minute. But in your opinion, why do you think they exclude that from negotiations? Why do they just assume it's the 67 borders and this is the lot of Palestinians and they have to just deal, if at all?
Well, I mean, the West is very happy to accept a fait accompli. Certainly an Israeli fait accompli, Hanan, especially when it comes at our expense.
Yeah.
And we've played our part in that as well back in the 1940s and 50s. I mean, I don't think the partition plan itself has ever been the basis of any kind of serious negotiation between Arab regimes and Israel. We dropped that very quickly. If you remember, in 1949, 1950, it became very clear that King Abdullah of Jordan and the Israelis had arrived at a modicum of understanding. Avi Shleim wrote a very interesting book about that. It's called the first title was Collusion Across the Jordan. The second title was The Politics of Partition, where there was an understanding between the Israelis and the Jordanians that Jordan would take the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and the Israelis would retain what they had conquered in the 1948 war. There is a book that I was going to recommend at the end of this podcast. It was written by Rajesh Hadi. It's called We Could Have Been Friends, My Father and I. It's 140 pages that offers just a brilliant synopsis, rich in detail, though, of the Palestinian struggle. And there's an incident that he refers to in that book that involves his father, a very important lawyer who was assassinated in the 1980s. Aziz Ishhadi in 1948 and 1949 moved. He was from Jaffa. He moved very quickly to establish a refugee council representing 350,000 of the 700,000 refugees that were 750,000 who were kicked out. And they went to Geneva to negotiate with the Israelis. And they met with Sassoon, who was if I'm not mistaken, the Secretary General of the Foreign Ministry then, or certainly a senior member of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, and met with them. And Sassoon said something very important to Aziz, which in fact represented a pillar, constituted a pillar of Israeli policy then. He said, we do not negotiate with groups. We only negotiate with states. And if you notice, the effort in the late 40s and 50s and onward was to ensure that there was never a Palestinian state so that you don't have to negotiate with it.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah. Actually, the Shahadis are my grandfather's and father's lawyers. They're very prominent, wonderful lawyers.
I mean, Rajesh Hadi is just one of the more brilliant voices on Palestine. His books are an absolute must-read on the Palestinian question, as Edward Said has put it in one of his books. So I think a fait accompli, Hanan. The West has no problem with the fait accompli. I mean, you're talking about the partition plan. Take a look at the 1967 borders. There's another fait accompli there. There are the 700,000 settlers in over 110 Israeli settlements, and another, I don't know how many tens of illegal outposts. That's a fait accompli.
Yeah.
Even when you're discussing the 22% that remains of Palestine, it is riddled with fait accomplis. So the West doesn't have a problem with it. Yeah. If the Israelis, and by the way, to answer your question, and from another perspective, the Israelis are very nimble that way. They will accept a certain kind of solution if the opportunity presents itself and they're able to win some more land. Wonderful. And take a look at the Golan Heights now.
Yeah.
An opportunity presented itself. Nothing. There was absolutely no threat to Israel whatsoever in what transpired in Syria over the past month or so. None. So what does Israel do? Immediately move to Jabal al-Sheikh and take it over. There was a huge debate in Lebanon today as to whether Israel was territorially interested in Lebanon. And I asked, and at one dinner party, I asked, friends discussing it. You can have differences of opinion. I asked them, what's one question? Had Hezbollah not resisted Israel when it occupied southern Lebanon after its invasion in 1982, would Israel have withdrawn or not? Most of them said no, it would not have withdrawn. I say, there you go. You present it with an opportunity, it'll take the land. But I subscribe to Rashid Khaldi here. Where there is occupation, there's resistance.
Yeah, I agree with you. And they've taken over 30% of the water supplies in Syria already and destroyed the infrastructure.
It remains to be seen whether this fait accompli the West will also accept. I suspect they would. Why not? But I also suspect that there's going to be very serious resistance.
I agree.
And so if you're going to ask me the question as to what we expect in the future, here's your answer. Very simply, if the state is not made to understand the limitations of its power, if we are not going to approach the geopolitics of this region, the politics of this region along more creative, more humane, more generous appreciation of each other's requirements and insecurities and needs and aspirations and ambitions, this region will never see a day of peace. You will see lulls, but you will never see a day of true peace.
I think that creativity and humanism that you mentioned there are absolutely key, and not things that we've associated with the region up till now, thanks to colonialism and outside things. We talked about Raja Shahadin and his amazing books. Let me talk about your book, Amal, if I can switch gears. Your latest book. Yes, please. For me, the writer, This Arab Life, A Generation's Journey into Silence. What's that generation? And tell us a little bit about that journey.
My generation, Hanan, and my generation, the generation that came of political age in the 1980s. So the Arab uprisings have really triggered, of course, much thinking in many of us Arabs. For me, they were pivotal. I think seismic in all respects, and they forced some very difficult questions that really invited me to undertake a quest for clarity. But what transpired where between the time when I came of political age in the 1980s and the Arab uprisings themselves that might explain from a more intimate perspective how we ended up here. And that's essentially the book. And I wanted to take it I wanted the flip side of it. I mean, you never ever, or almost never, or rarely come across books about the history of the region that are told from an intimate perspective, personal books written by its children. And I wanted to offer that kind of intimate perspective. I thought that there was a generational story here that crossed borders and classes and ideologies and societies, and I wanted to tell it, and that's why I wrote the book. And to put it in another way, I wrote, and I always write, to tell you the truth, to achieve clarity. I never achieve clarity before I write. I'm not that kind of writer. I always write as a quest for clarity. So I wrote. I just decided by 2018, I think, I sat down and journeyed back to over the 50 years and attempted an interpretation of culture, politics, and history that might explain to the reader what brought us to a moment of true peril and promise at the same time in the region.
Yeah, that's so interesting about using writing to explore a route to clarity. And I hate this question because, in a way, because I get asked it a lot from a different perspective, South Asian, LGBTQ, whatever that might be, about representation and about having this importance to telling the story. But the fact is, as you said, there are very few books written from this personal, nuanced perspective that feature Levant or an Arab mindset. So, what is the importance of that and putting that out there into the world? And who are you aiming this book at?
Well, I wrote for myself first.
I love that.
But a lot of writers do, and I think that's actually very important.
It was necessary for me to do this because I noticed as well, since and Hanan is very familiar with this. I mean, she left the Arab world a long time ago, but I think she's intimately familiar with what I'm going to say now.
Amal, you had something to do with it, but that's another story.
Well, when you write as an Arab, there are these self-censorship triggers that occur. So I noticed when I started writing that I was reflexively doing this, and I said, don't assume that you're writing for anybody. To begin with, this is your own quest for clarity. So write for yourself, and then read the book and decide what you want to keep, what you want to move, what's too sensitive, what's too subversive, what's too... And I have to tell you something. It was a pleasant surprise because I really didn't eliminate that much. And I didn't encounter... It's in English, so that always makes it easier. But I didn't encounter any difficulties, I have to say. To begin with, I wrote for myself. I also wrote for my nephews and nieces, because in conversations with them, certainly my nephews, the sons of my brother, I've lived in Jordan all their life. My nieces have not. I would talk to Faris, for example, and he would very interested in politics, very engaged, knows his stuff. He would look at me and say, I don't recognize this Jordan that you're talking about. I don't recognize this Amman. I mean, you're talking about, and he grew up in Jordan. You're talking about places, culture, politics I'm really not familiar with. And he's a very well-read man. And I thought the severing of memory that generations suffer, the kind of my Jordan and how alien it becomes to those who come after me, their Jordan and how alien it is to me. I wanted to repair that. I wanted to tell the new generation of a Levant, a moment in the Levant, a politics in the Levant, a culture in the Levant, a way of life in the Levant that could help them establish some kind of continuity in their understanding of their place in the region and their identity. Now, of course, as a writer, you're always hopeful that this story is going to resonate beyond your own, conception of reader. I wrote it in English. I published it in the United States because I wanted Americans who are keen on the area, who are interested in the area, or somewhat familiar in the area. I can't say it's for the general public. It isn't. I mean, you have to be interested in the area. You have to know something about it, to be curious about it. I wanted to introduce them to the region through a very intimate perspective. I have to tell you, I was just very tired of being written about. I wanted to write about myself. I wanted my voice out there as a narrator. This Arab life was the the gift that I gave to myself first, and hopefully that, in fact, not hopefully, it actually did very well. It ended up really resonating quite well, and I've been very gratified really by the feedback. So.
No, and Amal, absolutely, and you should be proud of it, because it's very important for the next generation, and to share your stories and your narrative and so on. And you have influenced people. You've influenced me when we were doing our university degree, talking about colonialism and setting it straight for me, which is very.
You were a bad girl then, Hanan. You are a
Well,
bad.
I wasn't as I don't know about that. I wasn't as enlightened as you. Let's see, Amal, you talk about influencing somebody's trajectory. When we were 11, we went to a summer school, Amal and I don't know if I
Yes.
told
You never make me forget that day. Yes, yes.
Never, never. No, and not only that. And then Amal said, okay, why don't we go to boarding school? I'm like, okay, why not? And then we book, and then
You regret it? You don't regret it.
I don't. But the last minute you dropped out, and I ended up taking a different
Listen,
path.
you were courageous. I was not. I was having too much of a good time at Orthodoxy. I just didn't want to leave. I was having a great time. So
I know
give me
you.
for that. Give me for
Well,
that.
I miss having you as part of that journey, but that's how I end up leaving earlier. So Amal had something to do with it.
You're right.
But
I
no,
own up. I own
it
up.
was a fun summer as well with what we had.
Yes.
But Amal, to go back to, well, it's definitely important, your influence and your continued, I think, activism, certainly through your books, your blog, your talks, your interviews, and so on. But if we go back to Palestine, because I'd love your opinion on it, I no longer believe in two-state solution, because in my opinion, um, Israel is an apartheid state. It's a Zionist, ethno-supremacist settler colonial project, as you know. And I only see the only solution is to dismantle this Zionist entity, this Zionist colony, and to have instead one single state with equal rights for all citizens, regardless of your religion, your skin color, your ethnicity. It's like in America or here in the West saying, oh, if you're black, you can't vote, or if you're a certain religion. So for me, it's important. And Ilan Pape, the historian, said his quote was, "The big question is, are Jews willing to live as equal citizens? Palestinians have always been willing." So, Amal, I'd love to hear your perspective about the path forward, the solution. Do you have a different sort of ideal that you would like to share?
Well, I mean, I'm perfectly, I subscribe to this perspective, but I have to tell you, it's not realistic.
I know, but still.
So I think it's a point of, I don't know if we can even, we can propose it as a point of departure. I mean, it's something to hold very close to our heart, clearly. But I think let's start from the other. Let's start from the other perspective, the more the doomsday scenario, if you like.
Mm.
If this is a one-state reality today, and the country that established this one-state reality, that created this one-state reality, is Israel itself. On this land between the river and the sea are around 7 million Palestinians and 7 million Israelis.
Mm-hmm.
If there is not a genuine and serious effort on the part of both people to build for themselves a space where they can coexist peacefully, it's a very dire end, not only for the Palestinians, but for the Israelis. I mean, these two people are so intertwined in their destinies, in everything, in the space they share, in the historical experience, very painful historical experience, that if they don't move creatively, again, imaginatively, if they don't reimagine this space and their life together within it, it's going to be dire for both people and dire for the neighboring countries and dire for the region. It's that serious. So, are there different proposals or different scenarios or different ideas that can be explored? I think so. I think so. Is Israel in a place that allows it, in a mental, psychological, emotional, intellectual place that allows it to understand the absolute need to rethink its relationship to the Palestinians? I don't think so. I really don't think so. I'm not optimistic on that front. And if you ask me, today, all eyes are on, of course, Gaza, but the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, Jordan, Iraq, and Iran. This is not in a... The extraordinary thing about Israel, and I know, probably these are the last few words of the podcast. The extraordinary thing about Israel is for the last 80 years, it's always assumed that it can build a sustainable political project on its military victories. Its military victories have been quite resounding, not always, but at critical moments, quite resounding, but it's never been able to build a sustainable political project based on those, because it's never been willing to engage in a very serious conversation, a very serious discussion, a very serious process with those people it has conquered. In order for you to build on your victory, you have to have a very serious discussion. You have to have something very concrete, very tangible on offer to the people you conquered in order for them to buy into your project. It's never done that. It's always been about conquest. It's always been about military solutions. It's always been about military victories. It's always been about conquest. For a very intelligent people, it's remarkable how obtuse they are about the futility of these victories if you are not going to build a serious political project based on these. And it hasn't. So here we are. I subscribe to your perspective. I do take very seriously, by the way, I take very seriously Israelis' attachment to the land. I think we need to be very realistic about this as Levantines and as Arabs and as Palestinians. We have to understand the attachment that they have developed for this land, their commitment to this land. I think many Palestinians have. I think the Israelis, on the other hand, need to comprehend that this Palestinian sumud is very real. It has been extremely effective over the past 80 years. And I think between these two conceptions, I think there's much to engage the two people, but the Palestinians are ready, I think. They don't have a national movement. They don't have a leadership. I mean, again, the subject for another podcast, catastrophic mistakes and errors and strategic miscalculations, but equally so in many other ways for the Israelis. I'm not optimistic, but let's see.
Well, as we all know, Jewish people in the Arab world and the Muslim world for centuries have lived and coexisted in peace. It was only when the Zionist political ideology and the East European and European Jews were forced onto the indigenous people of the land, because there are around 3% Palestinian Jews living there and across the Arab world. So it's that imposition of the colonial ideology onto the land, onto Palestine, onto the region that has really caused this division and domination versus coexistence.
Yeah, I mean,
You might
yes,
have you.
but again, it's
Oh,
not,
yeah, Amal.
no, you're absolutely right, of course, but it's not black and white again. Okay, so now it was created in 1948. You've got 7 million Israelis, Jewish, well, not Jewish Israelis, but no, actually Jewish Israelis, it's true, because then you add the 1.8 Palestinian Israelis, and you have around 9 million. They're on the land, Hanan. They're attached to this land. They have a history in this land. They've grown families and businesses and lives and culture and politics on this land. I don't think any of us wants to propose telling them to pack up and go. That's just not realistic. And frankly, that's dealing to them what they have dealt to the Palestinians. Not acceptable. They are part of that land. You have to, any kind of solution that you propose has to include these Jewish Israelis who have now established a very clear presence on this land, a very clear commitment to it, a very clear devotion to it. And by the way, we need to, I mean, let's not forget, humanity has gone through these strategies many times throughout history. Most recently in the aftermath of World War II, there are exits, there are processes, healing that can take place. But you need a very serious, wise leadership that is just as concerned about the other people's, the adversaries' interests and needs and insecurities and ambitions and aspirations as it is about its own. The problem for Israel is that always it's thought only about itself, always, to the exclusion of everybody else. Palestinian, Levantine, Arab, American, European, all about them. And that exacts a very heavy price. And you see it today in Israel. You see it today in Israel. If you ask me for another forecast, watch the Israeli space, because this is not a well society. It is not a well polity. It is not a well people. Yeah. There's much turmoil that is beginning to show itself inside Israel itself. And I think that's the new story in all of this, by the way. The rest of the stories that we've been talking about in this podcast are all old and very familiar. The story that is new in this is what's going on inside Israel. Very little attention to it. You see it, you read up, and you really have to be very interested and engaged and read about it. But it doesn't really appear in the general discourse, or appear with seriousness. But this is this is a very interesting new story that is sure to play its role in the future of this Levant.
Yeah, the disintegration from within of the Jewish-Israeli.
Again, you're going for terminology that I know is very gratifying to you, but I would be careful there. I don't know about disintegration, but I would say certainly turmoil, trouble, pain, existential questions between the Jewish Israelis themselves.
Yeah. Which is possibly what's needed to start to change that outlook that you talked about. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I know you're not going to make you happy, because I know you like the practical solutions, but you talked briefly about the new president of Lebanon laying out a vision that's very nice, but almost impossible to achieve. What would be your ideal solution? Not practical, your ideal solution in a short space.
For Lebanon.
For Lebanon. Otherworldly. Look, if you were to take the main features that we discussed in the first question, Lebanon would have to address or be blessed with changes to every single one of these features in order for it to finally achieve the kind of quietude and coherence that would allow it to thrive as a state and as a society. You need first and foremost a very quiet regional context. You need for the region to be settled and quiet. Lebanon is very vulnerable to regional vibes and trends. If the region is in havoc or unsettled or nervous, Lebanon is going to exhibit all that nervousness by its nature. You need a new leadership in place that takes very serious the state building effort, which means that you're going to have to dismantle this ruling elite, or they sleep and have an epiphany and wake up and understand that there's been enough theft and looting and sectarian conflict and pettiness, and they have grown up and wisened up, and now they're going to take very seriously what they need to do and dismantle their power structures and invest in the authority and legitimacy of the state. Now you realize how crazy that sounds, right?
Yeah, is that really, because it's unlikely to come from within?
Frankly, because frankly, I mean, you need leadership for this kind of reform process.
Yeah.
Doesn't happen.
But are we talking about like a workers' revolution kind of leadership? Something that pushes.
Well, I mean, revolution is not going to happen in Lebanon.
Yeah,
it's not going to happen in Lebanon. It's not.
Yeah.
There's going to have to be a certain kind of internal and external pressure, a perfect storm, if you like, a perfect storm that puts extraordinary pressure on the structures of this bankrupt system that has actually paradoxically proved itself very resilient. The sectarianism of this place and the oligopolistic kind of proclivity of the ruling elite have really managed very well to keep the ruling elite in place. You don't practically have a state. You have a mess of state institutions. You have a society in pain. Really, really shameful social inequities, huge gaps between rich and poor. And I'm just, I can go on forever. And of course, we don't have forever, unfortunately. And yet the ruling elite are very much there presiding over this system. So it's going to have to be a perfect storm, a huge pressure internally and externally to push this ruling elite to finally undertake or remove itself or be removed, or itself understand that it needs to genuinely reform itself and the state. And as I'm talking, I feel like I'm sounding like a blithering idiot.
Not at all. I can sense the conflict. It's a conflict.
If I were sitting there and listening to this podcast and someone else was saying these words, I'd be going, "Oh my God, you're asking ideal." But
I asked you a very idealistic question. It's very hard.
Ideal has to be built on realistic.
I don't actually subscribe to that. I don't want to quote Rodgers and Hammerstein in such an intellectual podcast, but if you don't have a dream, how are you going to have a dream come true? It's always unless you imagine something wild, it's often out of people's conception.
But yes, but perhaps, but
it's all I can cling to in this crazy world, Amal.
You have, by the way, certain, drawing up constitution and including, certain clauses that call for the dismantling of the sectarian formation of the state, and including the process through which you would do so. The gradual, sustained, concerted reforms that need to unfold one after the other. These are not really very difficult in a country like this. It's a tiny place. And I know, well, I genuinely think that the people are really very much ready for this. This is an exhausted people, really exhausted. I don't think you will witness or experience much pushback on the ground. It's a tiny place. It can be very well managed, extraordinarily talented people, very innovative, very entrepreneurial, and I don't mean in the narrow mercantilist sense only. There's a genuine love for this country, I have to admit. Don't necessarily have to admit it, but I have to say it. But it really takes remarkable, wise leadership to do so, and it requires serious support on the outside and serious effort on the inside. Is it going to happen? I don't think so. Is that absolutely imperative for any kind of a more promising future for the Lebanese? I think so.
Yeah, thank you. Amal, what about your projects right now? What are you working on, or what have you got coming up?
Writing. I am enjoying the blog very much. I'm involved in community development, as you know. I continue to be involved, and very. It's a way to be in touch. Different parts of this region, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Palestine. I'm very committed to that. Book, perhaps, but mum is the word. I won't say anything until I have a much better, a much clearer idea about what I might want to do with it. There you go.
I think a book is, yeah, I think a book is very important. Amal, is there anything else that you would like to share with our listeners that we haven't covered?
Listeners by now are probably cursing me. It's a good 1 hour and 40 minutes. That's been a very interesting conversation. No, I'll stop here. I think I've said what I needed to say.
Okay. Fair enough.
Well, let me just say thank you, Amal. Seriously, your views, your thoughts. I know you felt it ran long for us. It flew by because, I think there was incredible thought process there, incredible eloquence putting all of that together. I never fail to be amazed how you, Hanan, and so many people that I speak to have 3 or 4 languages, and you're so incredibly eloquent in all of them. You can follow Amal on amalghandour.com. We'll put the link into the show notes, and on Substack for her incisive writing, which is definitely worth a read, I can tell you. As we wrap up, make sure to join us for our next episode. If you enjoyed this talk, please like it and just subscribe to us. Please share it with other people. With your engagement and your support, our goal with this podcast is really to amplify voices and perspectives that are grounded in humanism and perhaps alternative to what we're seeing on mainstream media. Thank you again, Amal, for your invaluable insights and for the continued work that you do for Lebanon, Palestine, and everything else.
Thank you.
And as always, we believe that stories and representation matter. Stay informed, stay engaged, take action, and in solidarity. See you next time. And Amal, thank you again for all that you do. The Arab world needs more people like you. Don't be bashful about it, or Hada. And thank you again, Amal.
Thank you. Thank you, Hanan. Thank you, Shamim. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.